Imagine being in a room full of celebration, music playing, laughter echoing, lights shining, yet feeling completely invisible. Imagine that room is a wedding, and the invisible person is the daughter of the most powerful man in the room. This is a story about silence, courage, and how one ordinary voice can expose an extraordinary truth. Invisibility is a quiet kind of pain. It doesn't leave bruises, and it doesn't shout for attention, but it settles deeply into a person's sense of worth. When someone is ignored, it sends a message far more damaging than any insult ever could. It says, "You don't matter enough to be acknowledged." And that message, repeated over time, can reshape how a person sees themselves and the world around them. At the wedding, the CEO's paralyzed daughter was not insulted or mocked. No one said anything cruel to her face. Instead, people did something society often considers harmless. They looked away. They walked past her chair without pausing. They spoke over her, around her, but never to her. And in many ways, that silence was louder than cruelty, because words can be challenged, confronted, or defended against. Silence offers no such opportunity. Silence leaves a person alone with their thoughts, wondering why they were overlooked in a room full of people. Psychologists often say that human beings are wired for connection. From childhood, being seen and acknowledged tells us that we belong. A smile, a greeting, eye contact, these small gestures affirm our existence. When those gestures are absent, the brain interprets it as rejection. For someone living with a disability, this rejection happens repeatedly, in public spaces, social gatherings, and even celebrations meant to unite people. Over time, invisibility becomes normalized, and that is where the deepest harm lies. What makes invisibility especially painful is that it is often unintentional. Guests at the wedding likely believed they were being polite. They didn't want to say the wrong thing. They feared awkwardness, so they chose avoidance. But avoidance is not neutrality. It is a choice, and every choice has consequences. By choosing comfort over connection, they unintentionally placed emotional distance between themselves and a young woman who was already physically limited in her ability to move freely through the space. For the CEO's daughter, the pain wasn't just that people ignored her, it was that they noticed her difference and decided she wasn't worth the effort. That realization can be devastating. It teaches a person that their presence makes others uncomfortable, that their body is an inconvenience, that their story is less important. Over time, this can lead to isolation, anxiety, and a belief that asking for attention or inclusion is somehow selfish. Invisibility also strips people of their individuality. Instead of being seen as a person with thoughts, humor, interests, and emotions, someone becomes a symbol. A disabled person. A label rather than a human being. Labels make it easier to ignore someone because they reduce complexity. When people stop seeing individuals, empathy weakens. And without empathy, neglect becomes easy. This kind of harm isn't limited to disability. It affects the elderly who sit quietly at family gatherings, the shy student never called on in class, the single parent excluded from social circles, and anyone who doesn't fit society's ideal image of success or normalcy. Invisibility becomes a shared experience among those who live on the margins. And while each situation is different, the emotional impact is strikingly similar. A sense of not belonging. The CEO's wealth and influence could not shield his daughter from this pain. That is what makes the situation so powerful. Power, status, and money command attention, but they do not guarantee compassion. In that room, people gravitated toward what impressed them. The CEO's success, his connections, his authority. His daughter offered none of those things in their eyes, so she was overlooked. This reveals an uncomfortable truth. Society often values people based on what they contribute, not who they are. Invisibility also creates a cycle. When people are ignored repeatedly, they may withdraw, speak less, and avoid drawing attention to themselves. That withdrawal is then misinterpreted as disinterest or silence, reinforcing the belief that engagement isn't needed. The cycle continues, and the person fades further into the background, not because they want to, but because they've learned that presence doesn't guarantee recognition. What hurts most is that invisibility denies a person the dignity of choice. The CEO's daughter did not choose to be overlooked. She did not choose to be the quiet figure on the side of the celebration. That role was assigned to her by others, discomfort and indifference. And dignity, when taken away without consent, leaves a lasting wound. Recognizing invisibility requires intention. It means slowing down, noticing who hasn't spoken, who sits alone, who is being bypassed. It means understanding that inclusion is not about grand gestures but about acknowledgement. A simple conversation can restore a sense of humanity. A moment of attention can counter hours of neglect. When invisibility is replaced with recognition, people don't just feel seen, they feel valued. And that is why invisibility hurts more than words. Because words may sting, but being unseen questions your very place in the world. Discomfort is one of the strongest barriers to compassion, and often the least acknowledged. Most people like to believe they are kind, caring, and morally aware. Yet, when faced with situations that challenge their emotional ease, many retreat, not out of cruelty but out of unease. At the wedding, this discomfort was visible everywhere. Guests were not hostile toward the CEO's paralyzed daughter. They were uncertain. They didn't know how to act, what to say, or how to behave naturally. And in that uncertainty, compassion quietly disappeared. Discomfort arises when something interrupts our expectations of normalcy. A wedding is typically imagined as lively, glamorous, and visually perfect. When someone present doesn't fit that image, when their body, abilities, or presence reminds others of vulnerability, it disrupts the illusion. Disability forces people to confront realities they would rather avoid: fragility, dependence, unpredictability, and the fact that anyone's life can change instantly. Instead of processing these emotions, many people choose avoidance. They step back, look away, and create emotional distance. This reaction is deeply rooted in fear. Fear of saying the wrong thing, fear of causing offense, fear of appearing ignorant. But fear, when left unchecked, becomes an excuse for inaction. People convince themselves that silence is safer than engagement, that distance is more respectful than connection. In truth, this fear serves the comfort of the observer, not the dignity of the person being avoided. Compassion requires risk, the risk of awkwardness, the risk of imperfection, the risk of being wrong. At the wedding, guests likely justified their behavior internally. Some may have thought, she probably wants to be left alone. Others might have believed, her family will take care of her. These assumptions allow people to escape responsibility. They transform discomfort into logic. But these rationalizations ignore a fundamental truth: compassion cannot exist without presence. To care, one must first be willing to engage. Discomfort also thrives on lack of exposure. Many people have limited interaction with individuals who have disabilities. Without familiarity, myths and stereotypes fill the gap. Some assume disabled individuals are fragile, overly sensitive, or uninterested in social interaction. Others assume they are defined entirely by their condition. These misconceptions make interaction feel risky, so avoidance feels easier. Yet avoidance ensures that ignorance remains unchallenged. What makes discomfort especially dangerous is that it often disguises itself as politeness. People believe they are being respectful by not staring, not asking questions, not engaging. But respect without acknowledgement becomes erasure. Compassion is not about pretending differences don't exist. It's about recognizing them without allowing them to define worth. When people choose comfort over connection, they prioritize their own emotional safety at the expense of another's humanity. Discomfort also reinforces social hierarchies. At the wedding, guests were drawn to power, status, and success because those elements feel familiar and rewarding. Interacting with the CEO offered social benefit. Interacting with his daughter offered none, at least not in obvious terms. This imbalance reveals how discomfort intersects with self-interest. Compassion often requires giving attention without expecting anything in return, and that can feel unsettling in a society that values exchange and advantage. Another reason discomfort blocks compassion is time. Genuine engagement requires slowing down, listening, observing, adjusting behavior. In fast-paced social environments, people prefer interactions that are easy and predictable. The CEO's daughter required a pause, a shift in rhythm, a moment of intentional presence. For many guests, that pause felt inconvenient, so they moved on, choosing efficiency over empathy. Discomfort also stems from confronting one's own vulnerability. Seeing someone who cannot walk or move freely forces an uncomfortable reflection. This could be me. Rather than sit with that thought, many people distance themselves emotionally. By ignoring the person, they attempt to deny the possibility of their own fragility. In this way, avoidance becomes a defense mechanism, not against the other person, but against uncomfortable truths about life. The absence of compassion in such moments is rarely dramatic. There is no open rejection, no harsh statement, no visible conflict. Instead, it appears as empty space, chairs left unoccupied nearby, conversations that never start, eyes that slide past instead of meeting. This quiet absence is why it often goes unnoticed and why it persists. Discomfort doesn't announce itself. It hides behind social norms and personal excuses. Yet compassion begins the moment discomfort is challenged. The single dad at the wedding felt that same uncertainty, that same unfamiliarity, but he chose to step into it rather than retreat. He allowed himself to be awkward, unsure, and imperfect. That choice broke the invisible barrier that discomfort had built around the CEO's daughter. His action demonstrated that compassion is not a natural instinct. It is a decision. When discomfort is confronted, it loses power. Conversation replaces silence. Curiosity replaces fear. Humanity replaces assumptions. But as long as discomfort is allowed to dictate behavior, compassion remains blocked, and people continue to be ignored. Not because they are undeserving, but because engaging with them requires courage. One of the most powerful illusions in society is the belief that change must come from those at the top. We are conditioned to think that influence belongs to leaders, executives, officials, or people with titles. Authority is often associated with power, and power with action. Yet empathy operates on an entirely different scale. It does not require permission, status, or recognition. It requires only awareness and the willingness to act. The wedding made this truth unmistakably clear. The CEO was the most powerful person in the room. His presence commanded attention. Conversations paused when he spoke. People laughed at his jokes, nodded at his opinions, and positioned themselves close to him. His authority shaped the social atmosphere. And yet, despite all that power, it did not translate into empathy for his own daughter. Not because he didn't care, but because authority alone cannot force compassion into the hearts of others. Empathy cannot be commanded, it must be chosen. In contrast, the single dad had no status in that room. He wasn't influential, wealthy, or admired. He didn't have a microphone or a platform. In social terms, he was invisible too. Yet he was the only one who noticed the daughter's isolation and responded to it. This contrast reveals a crucial truth: empathy does not flow from power downward. It moves horizontally, from one human being to another. Authority often creates distance. People in positions of power are seen as separate, elevated, or untouchable. Their lives are assumed to be different, protected, or immune to struggle. As a result, their vulnerabilities are overlooked. The CEO's daughter existed within this paradox. People saw the wealth surrounding her and assumed safety, support, and fulfillment. They failed to see the loneliness because they believed privilege erased pain. Empathy requires looking beyond assumptions, and authority often reinforces them. The single dad's ability to empathize came not from education or influence, but from lived experience. He understood what it meant to be overlooked, to carry responsibility without recognition, to navigate spaces where you don't quite belong. Empathy often grows from shared vulnerability rather than shared status. It is shaped by experience, not rank. That is why those with the least power are sometimes the most perceptive. They have learned to read the room from the margins. Empathy also requires proximity. Authority can create barriers that prevent closeness. People approach powerful figures cautiously, strategically, or superficially. Genuine connection is rare in such interactions. The single dad, however, approached the CEO's daughter without expectation. He had nothing to gain. His presence was not transactional. That absence of motive made his empathy authentic. He wasn't performing kindness, he was practicing it. Another reason empathy doesn't require authority is that it often begins with small, unnoticed actions. A conversation, a question, a moment of listening. These acts don't make headlines, but they change internal worlds. The single dad didn't alter the structure of the wedding or address the crowd. He changed one person's experience of that space. And sometimes, that is where the most meaningful change occurs, not in public declarations, but in private moments of recognition. Society often underestimates the power of ordinary people. We are taught to wait for permission, to defer responsibility upward, to assume someone else will act. This mindset creates paralysis. At the wedding, many guests may have noticed the daughter's isolation, but assumed it wasn't their place to intervene. They deferred empathy to someone else, family, staff, or authority figures. The single dad refused that deferral. He understood that empathy is not assigned, it is assumed. Empathy also disrupts hierarchy. When someone without status steps forward, it challenges the idea that worth is measured by position. The single dad's action equalized the room. In that moment, titles disappeared. There was no CEO, no guest, no outsider, only two people in conversation. Empathy collapses social distance because it insists on shared humanity, and that insistence can feel threatening in spaces built on hierarchy. The absence of authority can even strengthen empathy. Without the pressure to maintain image or influence, people are freer to be sincere. The single dad didn't have to worry about saying the right thing in a strategic sense. He spoke as himself, That authenticity created trust, something authority often struggles to achieve. Empathy thrives where honesty is allowed. What this moment ultimately reveals is that waiting for leaders to model compassion is not enough. Empathy cannot be outsourced. It is not the responsibility of the powerful alone. Every individual carries the capacity to see, acknowledge, and respond. The single dad didn't change the room because of who he was. He changed it because of what he chose to do. And that choice, to act without authority, exposes a deeper truth. Empathy is not a function of power. It is a function of courage. Dignity is often spoken about as if it is something that can be gained or lost, given or taken away. In reality, dignity is inherent. It exists simply because a person exists. Yet society repeatedly behaves as though dignity is conditional, dependent on ability, productivity, appearance, or independence. The wedding scene revealed this contradiction clearly. The CEO's paralyzed daughter had not lost her dignity, but the way she was treated suggested that others believed she had. Disability challenges society's narrow definitions of worth. Many cultures celebrate strength, speed, independence, and control. When someone cannot walk, move freely, or perform tasks without assistance, they are often viewed through a lens of limitation rather than humanity. At the wedding, guests didn't see a young woman attending a celebration. They saw a wheelchair, a reminder of fragility, something that didn't fit the ideal image of joy and perfection. In reducing her to her disability, they unknowingly stripped away her dignity in their behavior. This loss of dignity was not caused by her condition, but by others' reactions to it. Disability itself does not erase intelligence, emotion, personality, or desire for connection. A paralyzed body does not mean a diminished mind or heart. Yet social behavior often suggests otherwise. When people speak around someone instead of to them, when they avoid eye contact, or when they assume incapacity without evidence, they communicate a message of lesser value. That message, repeated in countless subtle ways, becomes deeply dehumanizing. One of the most damaging assumptions about disability is that it makes a person passive. Society often treats disabled individuals as recipients rather than participants, as people to be managed, helped, or accommodated, but not engaged with. At the wedding, the CEO's daughter was present physically but excluded socially. She was placed in the space but not included in the experience. This distinction matters. Inclusion without engagement is still exclusion. True dignity requires recognition of agency, the understanding that a disabled person is still a person with opinions, preferences, and a voice. Dignity is closely tied to choice. Being able to choose how one interacts when one speaks and how one is seen is fundamental to human respect. Disability may limit physical movement, but it does not remove the right to choice. When others decide, without asking, that someone should be left alone, spoken for, or ignored, they override that person's autonomy. The CEO's daughter was not asked what she wanted. Her social role was assigned to her by assumption, not consent. There is also a tendency to confuse pity with respect. Some guests may have felt sorry for her, but pity, when not paired with respect, is another form of dismissal. Pity looks down, respect looks across. Pity centers the observer's emotions, respect centers the individual's humanity. By avoiding interaction, guests may have believed they were sparing her discomfort, when in fact they were reinforcing her isolation. Dignity is not preserved by distance, it is preserved by equality. Disability also exposes society's discomfort with dependence. Many people fear relying on others because independence is treated as moral superiority. When someone visibly requires assistance, it challenges that value system. Instead of questioning the system, society often devalues the individual. But dependence does not negate dignity. Every human being is dependent at some point in life: childhood, illness, aging. Disability simply makes that dependence visible, and visibility makes people uncomfortable. The CEO's daughter's dignity remained intact regardless of how she was treated. What changed was the atmosphere around her. Dignity is not something others can remove, but they can refuse to acknowledge it. That refusal creates harm not because the person becomes less worthy, but because they are denied the recognition they deserve. Recognition is how dignity is affirmed in social spaces. When the single dad approached her, he did something simple but profound. He treated her as an equal. He didn't lower his voice, exaggerate kindness, or avoid her condition. He spoke to her, not about her. In that interaction, her dignity was not restored because it was never gone, but it was recognized. And recognition is powerful. It reminds everyone watching that disability does not erase personhood. The belief that disability diminishes dignity is not natural, it is learned. It is reinforced by media, language, and social norms that equate value with ability. Challenging that belief requires intentional action. It requires seeing the person before the condition, the individual before the label. At the wedding, most people failed to do this, not out of malice, but out of conditioning. Understanding that disability does not diminish dignity forces a reevaluation of how society defines worth. It shifts focus from what a person can do to who they are, and that shift is uncomfortable because it removes easy measures of value. But it is necessary, because dignity, unlike ability, is not variable. It does not weaken, shrink, or disappear. It remains constant, waiting to be acknowledged. Change is often imagined as something loud, collective, and dramatic. We picture movements, speeches, and crowds. But real change frequently begins in far quieter ways, with a single person deciding not to remain silent. At the wedding, the atmosphere was not hostile, it was indifferent. Indifference is harder to confront because it feels normal, unchallenged, and socially acceptable. Yet it was precisely this indifference that defined the room, until one voice disrupted it. Before the single dad spoke up, the behavior of the guests followed an unspoken rule: ignore what makes you uncomfortable. This rule shaped the entire environment. People mirrored one another. When no one engaged with the CEO's daughter, others interpreted that as the appropriate response. Social spaces are governed by cues, and silence is one of the strongest cues of all. It signals permission. As long as no one acted differently, indifference felt justified. The single dad's action broke that pattern. He didn't need to call attention to himself or challenge anyone publicly. His voice did not echo through a microphone. Yet his decision to engage altered the social script. By acknowledging the daughter, he demonstrated that interaction was possible, acceptable, and human. In that moment, the invisible rules of the room changed. What was once avoided became approachable. One voice carries power because it creates an alternative. When people see someone act differently, it forces a comparison. Observers are confronted with a choice: continue the behavior they were following, or reconsider it. Many people are not intentionally unkind. They are simply following what seems normal. The single dad provided a new model of normal, one rooted in empathy rather than avoidance. That model made indifference harder to justify. There is also something deeply unsettling about being shown, without accusation, that a better response exists. The single dad didn't criticize the guests, but his action highlighted their inaction. Sometimes the most powerful challenge is not spoken aloud but demonstrated. His presence beside the daughter became a mirror, reflecting what others had failed to do. In that reflection, the room was forced to see itself. One voice can shift a room because courage is contagious. When one person steps forward, it reduces the risk for others. What once felt socially dangerous becomes socially acceptable. After the single dad engaged, others could follow without standing out. His action lowered the barrier to empathy. It showed that kindness would not be punished or ridiculed. In this way, one voice doesn't just act, it opens a door. This moment also reveals how fragile social norms are. The atmosphere of neglect felt solid, but it was actually sustained by hesitation and assumption. No one had agreed to ignore the daughter, they simply fell into that pattern. When the pattern was interrupted, it lost its hold. This demonstrates that many harmful social behaviors persist not because they are deeply believed, but because they are rarely questioned. The power of one voice lies in intention. The single dad didn't act to be seen or praised. His voice was guided by awareness, not ego. That sincerity gave his action weight. When people speak or act from genuine concern, it resonates differently. It feels real. And authenticity is difficult to dismiss, even in spaces dominated by status and performance. One voice also reclaims moral agency. It reminds everyone present that they are not passive participants in social environments. Each person contributes to the tone of a room, whether through action or inaction. By speaking up, the single dad reclaimed his responsibility as a human being, not just a guest. That reclamation implicitly invited others to do the same. What makes this moment especially powerful is that it did not require permission. The single dad did not wait for the host, the family, or someone more appropriate to act. He understood that empathy does not need authorization. Silence often persists because people are waiting for someone else to go first. One voice ends that waiting. The shift in the room may not have been immediate or dramatic, but it was real. Attention moved. Energy changed. The daughter was no longer isolated in the same way, and even those who did not act were affected. Awareness had entered the space, and once awareness exists, indifference becomes harder to maintain. This is why one voice matters. Not because it is loud, but because it is deliberate. It disrupts patterns, challenges assumptions, and reveals possibilities. In a room shaped by silence, one voice is not small, it is transformative. One of the most common ways people excuse inaction is by shifting responsibility elsewhere. We assume someone closer, more qualified, or more appropriate will intervene. In social settings, this mindset becomes especially strong. At the wedding, responsibility was silently passed around the room. Guests may have thought it was the family's role, the staff's role, or the host's role to ensure the CEO's daughter felt included. In doing so, they relieved themselves of personal accountability. And when responsibility belongs to everyone, it often ends up belonging to no one. The responsibility to see others is not assigned by role or relationship. It is a human obligation. Seeing someone does not require expertise, authority, or intimacy. It requires awareness. Yet awareness itself is a choice. In busy, stimulating environments, people often narrow their focus to what benefits them socially or emotionally. Conversations that feel easy, people who feel familiar, interactions that offer comfort or advantage. Anything outside that focus fades into the background. This narrowing is not accidental. It is practiced. At the wedding, guests chose where to direct their attention. Attention is a form of value. What we look at, who we listen to, and where we pause communicates what matters to us. By not directing attention toward the CEO's daughter, guests communicated, intentionally or not, that she did not matter enough to interrupt their comfort. Responsibility begins with recognizing that attention is not neutral. Withholding it has consequences. There is also a tendency to confuse responsibility with burden. Many people believe that noticing others will require emotional labor, time, or involvement they cannot afford. They fear being pulled into situations they don't know how to handle. But seeing someone does not mean fixing their life or solving their problems. It means acknowledging their presence. Responsibility, in this sense, is not about carrying weight. It is about refusing to pretend weight doesn't exist. Social conditioning plays a powerful role in shaping how responsibility is perceived. From a young age, people learn to mind their own business, avoid staring, and not interfere. While these rules are meant to protect privacy, they can also discourage empathy. The line between respect and neglect becomes blurred. At the wedding, many guests likely believed they were being respectful by keeping distance. But respect without recognition becomes neglect. Responsibility requires discernment, knowing when distance protects dignity and when it erases it. Another barrier to responsibility is the belief that good intentions are enough. People assume that because they don't mean harm, harm is not being done. But impact does not depend on intention. The CEO's daughter was affected by what happened around her, not by what guests meant. Responsibility means being willing to evaluate the impact of one's behavior, even when intentions are positive. It means accepting that silence can still wound. Responsibility also involves resisting social inertia. Once a room settles into a pattern, it takes effort to break it. Following the flow feels safer than interrupting it. At the wedding, the pattern was avoidance. To see the daughter meant stepping outside that pattern, risking awkwardness, or standing alone. Responsibility often demands this risk. It asks individuals to act not because it is easy, but because it is right. The idea that someone else will handle it is comforting because it removes urgency. It allows people to remain observers rather than participants. But empathy is not observational. It requires participation. The single dad understood this. He did not wait for a signal or an invitation. He accepted that the responsibility to act rested with him the moment he noticed the isolation. Awareness created obligation. Responsibility to see others also challenges self-centered narratives. Social events often encourage performance, networking, impression management, enjoyment. In these settings, people prioritize their own experience. Seeing others requires a shift outward. It requires recognizing that shared spaces carry shared responsibility. Everyone contributes to whether a space feels welcoming or excluding. No one is merely a bystander. Ignoring this responsibility has long-term effects. When people repeatedly experience being unseen, they internalize it. They may stop expecting recognition. They may lower their presence, silence their needs, or withdraw altogether. Society then interprets this withdrawal as preference rather than response. The cycle continues. Responsibility, when neglected, doesn't disappear, it compounds. Accepting responsibility to see others does not mean constant vigilance or perfection. It means cultivating a habit of awareness, noticing who is quiet, who is alone, who is being passed over. It means understanding that inclusion is not automatic, it is created through choices. Each moment offers an opportunity to either reinforce invisibility or interrupt it. At the wedding, most people relinquished that responsibility without realizing it. The single dad accepted it without announcement. That contrast reveals a fundamental truth: responsibility is not something we are given. It is something we either claim or avoid. This story leaves us with a question that is impossible to ignore when we enter a room. What do we bring with us? Comfort or courage? Because the truth is, exclusion doesn't always look like cruelty. Sometimes it looks like silence. Sometimes it looks like politeness. Sometimes it looks like people waiting for someone else to act. But dignity doesn't need permission. Empathy doesn't require authority. And change doesn't wait for a crowd. It begins the moment one person decides to see another, not as an inconvenience, not as a condition, not as a symbol, but as a human being. The CEO's daughter did not need to be saved. She needed to be seen. And the single dad didn't change the room by being powerful. He changed it by being present. So the next time you find yourself in a room full of people, remember this: look for the one being overlooked. Speak when silence feels easier. Choose compassion even when discomfort whispers otherwise. Because one voice can shift a room, and sometimes that voice has to be yours.